The crystal decanter felt cool in my palm as I lifted it, the amber liquid inside catching the low amber glow of the chandeliers overhead. 8 months I'd worked at the Velvet Room. 8 months of memorizing faces, tracking patterns, and keeping every observation locked behind my teeth. But tonight was different. The private club smelled of cigar smoke and aged leather, undercut by the sharp botanical notes of expensive gin and the subtle metallic tang that clung to $100 bills exchanged in shadowed booths. The floor beneath my heels, polished black marble veined with gold, reflected distorted shapes of the city's most dangerous men. Around Sebastiano Colosimo's corner table, the air itself seemed heavier, as though danger had its own weight and gravity. "Another bourbon," one of his associates said, barely glancing at me. Not Sebastiano, though. He never spoke to service staff. He simply existed, a gravitational force in a tailored charcoal suit. His presence commanding silence from everyone within a 10-foot radius. At 38, he carried himself with the stillness of a man who'd never needed to raise his voice to end a life. The scar along his jaw, thin, deliberate, caught the light as he tilted his head, listening to his consigliere murmur something about shipping schedules. I approached with the tray, the fresh glass positioned at the exact angle for his dominant hand. My breathing was measured, my expression neutral. That's how I survived, by becoming invisible, by letting my anxiety sharpen into a blade that cut through every detail in a room until I could map it perfectly in my mind. That's when I saw it. The glass the bartender had just handed me, the one I'd watched him polish with clinical precision 30 seconds ago, had a faint irregularity along the inner rim. Not a smudge, not a water spot. An oily film, almost invisible unless the light hit it at exactly the right angle, pooling just where a man's lips would touch when he drank. My heart slammed against my ribs. Kept walking. Sebastiano's previous glass sat empty at his elbow. The ice melted into a thin pool at the bottom. The bartender had taken it during the table rotation, standard procedure when we swapped out linens and ashtrays for VIP sections. But this glass, the replacement, had come back wrong. I'd seen my mother die from contaminated medication when the pharmacy tech made an error. I knew what poison looked like when someone wanted it to look like nothing at all. I set the tray down with the rehearsed efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. The decanter made a soft clink against the silver tray. I poured, the bourbon cascading into the glass in a perfect amber stream, 2 fingers exactly, the way Sebastiano Colosimo preferred it. Years of watching my father's paranoid routines, checking locks, scanning faces, testing food, had taught me how to see threats others missed, how to move through chaos by controlling every variable I could touch. Sebastiano reached for the glass. His fingers, broad, scarred along the knuckles, closed around the crystal. I leaned in, adjusting the napkin beneath the decanter, my body angled so only he could hear. My voice came out steady, barely a whisper threading between the jazz piano and low conversation around us. "They poisoned your drink. Don't drink it." His entire body went still. The glass hovered an inch from his lips. For 3 seconds, the world contracted to the space between us. His dark eyes locking onto mine, searching for deception, for hysteria, for any sign I was wrong. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I'd spent my entire life reading rooms to survive my anxiety, and I knew exactly how much danger we were in. Explain. One word. Command, not a question. I kept my hands moving, straightening the already straight coaster, wiping an invisible drop from the table's edge. To anyone watching, I was simply attending to my duties. "The glass came back from the bar rotation," I said, my voice barely audible. "Inside rim. Oily residue at the 10 o'clock position. Wasn't there when it left your table." The bartender didn't touch his station after handing it off, but someone else did. Sebastiano set the glass down with deliberate precision, the soft clink of crystal against wood somehow louder than it should have been. His jaw tightened, the muscle there flexing once beneath his 5 o'clock shadow. When he looked up at me again, his expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A predator realizing the prey had just saved his life. "Silas," he said, his voice carrying that particular edge that made grown men move. His capo appeared at his shoulder within seconds, a mountain of a man whose face revealed nothing. "Clear the table," Sebastiano said, his gaze still locked on mine. "We're moving to the back room. Bring the glass. And bring her." He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with the fluid grace of a man who'd never doubted his control of any situation. As he passed me, he paused, his voice dropping to a register only I could hear. "If you're wrong, we'll have a very short conversation. If you're right." He let the sentence hang unfinished, as dangerous as the poison still glistening on the rim of that glass. I wasn't wrong. My anxiety had spent 24 years turning me into a surveillance system with a heartbeat. And Sebastiano Colosimo had just become the first person who might actually understand what that meant. Before we continue, let's see if you notice patterns too. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if you're already hooked by Charlotte's warning, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to catch every detail of what happens next. Now let's get back to the story. The back room smelled of old wood and newer secrets. Sebastiano closed the door with a softness that felt more threatening than if he'd slammed it, the click of the lock echoing in the sudden silence. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany, lined with shelves holding books that looked more decorative than read. A single desk lamp cast a pool of amber light across the surface where Silas had placed the poisoned glass, now sitting in a clear evidence bag like an accusation. I stood with my back straight, hands clasped in front of me, counting my breaths the way my therapist had taught me. 4 in, hold for 7, 8 out. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained still. Sebastiano circled me once, his footsteps deliberate on the Persian rug. When he stopped, he was close enough that I could smell the cedar notes of his cologne mixing with the faint scent of bourbon that clung to his shirt. "You have 10 seconds to convince me you're not part of this," he said. "If I were part of it, I wouldn't have warned you." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I would have let you drink and walked away clean. No one would have suspected the waitress who'd been here 8 months. His eyes narrowed, studying me with the intensity of a man who'd built an empire on reading people. "Then why did you notice? Silas has been with me for 12 years. My bartender 8. They didn't see anything wrong. This was the moment. The moment I always avoided. The reason I'd spent years hiding behind service industry anonymity, keeping my head down and my observations to myself. But Sebastiano Colosimo wasn't going to accept evasion. "I have generalized anxiety disorder," I said, the words tasting like exposure. "Severe. The kind that made me drop out of college twice because I couldn't walk into a classroom without counting every exit and memorizing every face. Can't turn it off. My brain catalogs everything. Every shift in posture, every micro-expression, every object that's moved an inch from where it was 5 minutes ago." I gestured toward the glass. "That residue wasn't there when the glass left this table. I watched your associate finish his drink at 9:47. I watched the bartender polish that replacement glass at 9:51. When it came back at 9:53, the film was there. 2 minutes. Someone intercepted it." Sebastiano was silent for a long moment, his jaw working as he processed this. Then he moved to the desk, pulling out a leather folder filled with photographs. He spread them across the surface. 8 men, all in suits, all wearing the expression of people who lived in his world. "Point to the man who's lying," he said. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening. This wasn't about the poison anymore. This was a test. The photographs were from what looked like a meeting, all 8 men seated around a conference table. I scanned each face, letting my brain do what it did best: absorb, catalog, compare. Third from the left. His shoulders were rotated 15 degrees away from the table while everyone else leaned in. His smile reached his mouth but stopped before his eyes. His left hand was tucked beneath the table's edge, fingers likely drumming against his thigh based on the tension in his forearm. I tapped the photograph. Him. He's afraid of something in that room and trying to hide it. Sebastiano's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between us. He gathered the photographs, slid them back into the folder, and turned to face me fully. That's Lucian De Santo, my consigliere for 6 years. My brother-in-law. He paused, letting the weight of that relationship settle. As of an hour ago, my head of security confirmed he's been meeting with the Grimaldi family. The poison was his opening move. My stomach dropped. I just identified a traitor in Sebastiano's inner circle. Family member. You don't work tables anymore, Sebastiano said, his voice carrying the finality of a closed door and an opened one. As of tonight, you work for me. Personal analyst. You see what I can't see. You tell me what I need to hear. And in return. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the small space. I keep you alive. Because after tonight, Charlotte, staying invisible is no longer an option for you. The room felt smaller. The air thinner. I'd saved his life, and in doing so, I just signed away any chance of returning to the shadows where I'd spent years learning to hide. The anxiety that had always been my curse had just become the only thing keeping me breathing in a world where loyalty was currency and betrayal was a death sentence. And Sebastiano Colosimo was waiting for my answer. The conference room existed in a space between legitimate and lethal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city's glittering skyline, while the mahogany table stretched long enough to seat 12 men whose combined rap sheets could fill a filing cabinet. I sat in the corner, a notepad in my lap that I didn't need, my presence explained away as Sebastiano's new executive assistant. No one questioned it. No one questioned him. Lucian De Santo arrived 7 minutes late. His Armani suit perfectly pressed. His smile easy as he clasped hands with the others around the table. He kissed Sebastiano on both cheeks in the traditional way. His movements fluid and unhurried. To anyone else, he looked like a man who belonged exactly where he was. Second in command, trusted advisor, family. But I'd spent my entire life watching people lie to survive. Apologies, Lucian said, settling into the chair at Sebastiano's right hand. Traffic was a nightmare coming from the port. Sebastiano nodded, gesturing for Silas to begin. The capo laid out the facts with military precision. The poisoned glass, the 2-minute window, the likelihood of inside coordination. As he spoke, I watched Lucian's face. He maintained perfect eye contact, his expression appropriately grave, his head tilting at the expected moments of concern. But his body told a different story. He sat too far back in his chair, his spine pressed against the leather in a way that created distance from the table's edge. Everyone else leaned forward, engaged. Lucian's posture screamed withdrawal, like a man trying to physically separate himself from the conversation. His right hand rested on the armrest, fingers drumming a staccato rhythm. Too fast, too irregular. Stress bleed. We need to look at the security rotation, Lucian said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. Someone compromised the bartender or the floor staff. We should interrogate everyone who had access to that section. Sebastiano's eyes flicked to me. It was barely a glance, gone in a heartbeat, but I understood. He was giving me the floor without saying a word. I shifted in my seat, drawing attention like I'd accidentally made noise. All eyes turned to me. The weight of their stares pressed against my skin, triggering every instinct to shrink, to disappear. I counted the ceiling tiles instead. 12 across. My heartbeat slowed. May I ask a question? My voice came out quiet but clear. Lucian's smile was indulgent, almost paternal. Of course, sweetheart. The condescension was intentional. An attempt to diminish me before I spoke. Mr. De Santo, you mentioned the port traffic. I met his eyes, forcing myself to hold contact even as my palms dampened. Which route did you take? The harbor bridge was closed for maintenance from 7 to midnight tonight. It was on the news. The silence that followed felt like falling. Lucian's smile never wavered, but his left eye twitched. Just once, a microspasm that lasted less than a second. His hand on the armrest stilled completely, fingers locked in place. "I must have misremembered," he said smoothly. "It was yesterday I came from the port. Tonight I was across town. Dining with the Calabrese family, actually. We're negotiating." "Your jacket," I interrupted, my anxiety transforming into something sharper, something useful. "You're wearing the same one from the photograph in Sebastiano's office. The one taken at the port meeting 3 days ago. There's a small coffee stain on the left lapel, right below the pocket square. Same position." Lucian looked down reflexively. The stain was barely visible, a faint brown shadow against the dark fabric. When he looked back up, the easy charm had evaporated from his face, replaced by something colder. "Calculating. Are you accusing me of something, Miss Johnson?" The room had gone deadly quiet. Even Silas, who I'd learned never stopped moving, sat perfectly still, his hand resting near his hip where I knew he kept a weapon. Sebastiano leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He looked relaxed, almost bored, but I'd started learning his tells too. The way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The way his breathing slowed like a predator before the strike. "Charlotte," he said, my name sounding different in his mouth than anyone else's. "What else do you see?" This was it. The moment I stepped fully into his world or retreated back to safety. Except there was no safety anymore. There never had been. I'd just been better at pretending. I looked at Lucian de Santo, brother-in-law, consigliere, traitor, and spoke the truth that would either save me or destroy me. "His hands are shaking." Lucian's fingers, still frozen on the armrest, betrayed him with the slightest tremor. The kind that came from adrenaline, from fear, from knowing the walls were closing in and there was nowhere left to run. Sebastiano smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. The smile disappeared as quickly as it had come. Sebastiano stood, buttoning his suit jacket with movements so controlled they seemed choreographed. The room held its breath. "Lucian, walk with me." It wasn't a request. Lucian rose on legs that looked suddenly unsteady, his earlier confidence crumbling like wet paper. Sebastiano placed a hand on his shoulder, brotherly, almost affectionate, and guided him toward the door. Silas moved to follow, but Sebastiano shook his head once. Just once. "Charlotte comes." My stomach dropped. I stood, my notepad falling forgotten to the chair, and followed them into the hallway. The door closed behind us with a sound like a coffin ceiling. We walked in silence, our footsteps muffled by crimson carpet, past oil paintings of men whose eyes seemed to follow our procession. Sebastiano's hand never left Lucian's shoulder. We descended a staircase I'd never noticed before, one that led below the club's main floor. The air grew colder with each step, the scent of aged wine and something metallic replacing the cigar smoke from above. At the bottom, Sebastiano pushed open a steel door that groaned on its hinges. The room beyond was bare concrete and harsh fluorescent light. 3 men I recognized from the club's security detail stood at attention, their faces carefully blank. In the center of the room, 2 chairs sat bolted to the floor, facing each other like confessors. "Sit," Sebastiano said to Lucian, his voice empty of everything that had once been family. Lucian sat. His hands were shaking openly now, no longer trying to hide it. I stood against the wall, my back pressed to the cold concrete, trying to understand why I was here, why Sebastiano wanted me to witness this. "The Grimaldis offered you what?" Sebastiano asked, conversational like they were discussing the weather. "Sebastiano, I don't. Don't insult me further." The words came out soft, which somehow made them worse. "Charlotte already proved you're a liar. I'm giving you the chance to die with some dignity. Take it." Lucian's breath came faster, his chest heaving. "Territory. They offered me territory. Brooklyn and half of Queens. My own operation. Your sister. She doesn't understand what it's like, living in your shadow. Always second, never first. I have ambitions too. You had ambitions, Sebastiano corrected. He pulled a phone from his pocket, dialed a number, and put it on speaker. It rang twice before a voice answered. Rough, unfamiliar. It's done, Sebastiano said. Lucian's associates. All 4 of them. The ones he met with last week at the warehouse. There was a pause, then a wet, choking sound through the speaker. A gunshot. Then another. Then silence. Confirmed, the voice said, and the line went dead. Lucian's face drained of color. No, Marco was just. He didn't know anything, he was just. He was complicit. Sebastiano pocketed the phone and drew a gun from inside his jacket, the movement smooth and practiced. You don't poison a king without soldiers willing to watch him die. He raised the weapon and I couldn't look away. My therapist had told me exposure therapy meant facing fears gradually, in controlled doses. There was nothing controlled about this. Nothing gradual. This was the world I'd stepped into when I'd whispered that warning, and Sebastiano was making sure I understood exactly what my observations cost. The gunshot was louder than I expected. Lucian's body slumped forward, held upright only by the chair. Blood spread across the concrete in a pattern I knew I'd see every time I closed my eyes. Sebastiano turned to me, the gun still in his hand. His expression unreadable. You did this, he said, and my heart stopped. You saved my life, and in doing so, you exposed a cancer that would have killed a dozen more of my men. This, he gestured to Lucian's body, is mercy compared to what the Grimaldis would have done to us all. He crossed the room until he stood directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. You understand what you are now. What you mean to this organization. I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. My entire body shook with an adrenaline I couldn't process. You're not staff anymore, Charlotte. You're not an employee. You're mine. He said it with the certainty of a man stating facts, not claiming ownership. Protected by me. Valued by me. Which means everyone who wants me dead will want you dead first. And I will burn this city to ash before I let that happen. He holstered the gun and held out his hand, palm up, waiting. An offering. A choice that wasn't really a choice anymore. Took it. His fingers closed around mine, warm and solid and stained with blood I couldn't see but knew was there. Good, he said softly. Now let's go upstairs. You need to eat something. You're shaking. And as he led me back toward the light, I realized he was right. My life was no longer my own. It belonged to him now, bound by bullets and bourbon and the terrible gift of seeing what others missed. 3 weeks after Lucian died, I moved into the penthouse above the club. Not because Sebastiano demanded it, but because going home to my studio apartment meant lying awake counting the shadows on the ceiling, wondering which one held a gun. The penthouse had better security, better sight lines, better chances of survival. I worked at his desk now, surrounded by ledgers that detailed shipments I didn't ask about and names I learned to memorize without judgment. My job wasn't to question the empire. It was to see the cracks before they split it open. Tonight, the city spread below us like scattered diamonds, the floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting our images back in ghost-like doubles. Sebastiano paced near the bar, his usual stillness replaced by restless energy. He'd been like this since the phone call an hour ago. Shoulders tense, jaw tight, movements sharp instead of fluid. You should go to bed, he said, pouring himself a scotch he wouldn't drink. It's past midnight. I didn't look up from the surveillance photos spread across the mahogany surface. So should you. He laughed, but it sounded wrong. Hello. I haven't slept properly in 15 years, Charlotte. Not since I killed my father. My hands stilled on the photographs. The statement hung in the air between us, heavy with intention. This was a test. He was showing me the darkest corner of his history, waiting to see if I'd flinch, if I'd run, if I'd prove I was just another person who'd eventually betray him. I looked up, meeting his eyes across the room. Did he deserve it? Does it matter? To my analysis of you. To my opinion of you. Paused, choosing truth over comfort. No. You're not the man you were at 23. And whoever your father was, he made you into someone who burned cities to protect the people he values. I've seen worse sins. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or relief. He set down the untouched scotch and moved to the desk, leaning against its edge close enough that I could smell cedar and expensive fabric and the faint scent of gunpowder that never quite left his clothes. You're not afraid of me, he said, and it wasn't a question. I'm terrified of you, I corrected. I'm just more afraid of what happens if I pretend you're something you're not. You need honesty, not comfort. That's why I'm useful. His gaze held mine, intense and searching, and I realized how close we were. Close enough to see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his chest rose and fell with breaths that had slowed to match mine. The shipment from Montenegro, I said, forcing myself back to the photographs because the alternative was falling into whatever this moment was becoming. The one you've been worrying about since that call. It's not compromised. How do you know? I tapped a photo showing 3 men unloading crates at the dock. Your contact, Victor, his body language is relaxed. Open shoulders, casual stance. If he'd been turned or threatened, he'd show stress indicators, tight movements, excessive checking of his surroundings. He's calm because the operation is clean. Sebastiano studied the photo, then me, his expression unreadable. You see everything, don't you? Almost everything. What don't you see? The question caught me off guard. Before I could answer, he reached out and took the photograph from my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. The touch lasted a second longer than necessary, deliberate and warm, sending electricity up my arm that had nothing to do with fear. I don't see what you're thinking right now, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. He set the photo down but didn't release my hand. His thumb traced a slow line across my knuckles, the gesture achingly gentle from a man I'd watched execute his brother-in-law without hesitation. I'm thinking, he said softly, that I haven't trusted anyone this much since I was a boy. And I'm trying to decide if that makes you the most valuable person in my life or the most dangerous. Both, I whispered because it was true. 'Cause we both knew it. He lifted my hand, pressing it flat against his chest where I could feel his heartbeat. Steady, strong, alive because I'd warned him about poison in a glass. His other hand came up to cup my face, thumb brushing across my cheekbone with devastating tenderness. Charlotte. My name was a question and a warning and a plea all at once. I leaned into his palm, letting myself want this, want him, even though every logical part of my brain screamed that this was the worst possible decision. That loving a man like Sebastiano Colosimo meant accepting that every day could be the last. That his enemies would use me as a weapon against him. That I'd already signed my death warrant just by sitting at his desk. But I'd spent my whole life afraid. And for the first time, fear felt like a price worth paying. His lips met mine with a hunger that felt like surrender, and I kissed him back like a woman who'd finally stopped running. The kiss had changed everything and nothing. Sebastiano still paced at night. I still catalogued threats from his desk. But now when our eyes met across the room, the air felt heavier, charged with something that made my pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with anxiety. I was reviewing shipping manifests when Girolamo Colosimo appeared in the doorway of the penthouse study. I hadn't heard him enter, which sent my threat assessment into overdrive. He was older than Sebastiano by a decade, silver threading through his dark hair. His suit custom-tailored to hide the weight he carried with the authority of old money and older violence. Miss Johnson. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. May I have a moment? I set down my pen, hyper-aware that Sebastiano was 3 floors below in a meeting with his capos. That Silas wasn't stationed outside the door. That I was alone with a man whose expression reminded me of my father's right before he'd put his fist through a wall. Of course, Mr. Colosimo. He moved into the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who'd never needed to announce his presence to be feared. He picked up a crystal paperweight from the desk, examined it, set it down 2 inches to the left of where it had been. The displacement was intentional. Power play. You've done remarkable work these past weeks, he said conversationally. Lucian's betrayal, the Montenegro situation, the surveillance analysis that prevented the warehouse raid. My cousin speaks very highly of you. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Are you? He turned to face me fully, and the pleasant mask slipped just enough to show the calculation beneath. Or are you simply grateful to be alive? Because let's be honest, Charlotte. May I call you Charlotte? Women in your position don't typically survive long in our world. My hands wanted to shake. I flattened them against the desk instead. What position is that? The position of being indispensable to a man who has enemies lining up to take his throne. Girolamo moved closer, leaning against the desk's edge in a mirror of how Sebastiano had stood 4 nights ago. But where Sebastiano's proximity had felt magnetic, his cousin's felt like a noose tightening. You saved his life. You identified a traitor. You've made yourself valuable. Which means you've also made yourself a target. I understand the risks. Do you? His voice dropped lower, almost gentle. The Grimaldis lost their inside man because of you. Their poisoning failed because of you. Do you think they'll simply accept that? Do you think they won't study you, learn your patterns, discover that you have a younger sister named Elodie who attends Columbia? That your mother is buried in Queens but your father is still drinking himself to death in the Bronx? It flooded my veins. He'd done his homework. Every name he spoke was a threat wrapped in information, a reminder that my value to Sebastiano made everyone I'd ever loved vulnerable. Sebastiano protects what's his, I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. Sebastiano protects his empire, Girolamo corrected. And sometimes, Miss Johnson, the best way to protect an empire is to remove the pieces that attract too much attention. Lucian learned that. So did his wife, my niece, who now lives in Sicily, forbidden from ever returning because her husband's betrayal stained her by association. He straightened, smoothing his tie with manicured fingers. I'm not telling you this to frighten you. I'm telling you because I care about my cousin. And I've seen what happens when powerful men allow affection to compromise their judgment. You're brilliant. You're useful. But you're also a liability he can't afford. Not with the Grimaldis circling. Then what would you have me do? The question came out sharper than intended, my anxiety crystallizing into something closer to anger. Disappear. Run. Pretend the past month never happened. I'd have you consider, he said carefully, whether loving Sebastiano Colosimo is worth watching everyone you care about die for it. Because that's what's coming, Charlotte. The Grimaldis won't kill you cleanly. They'll make you watch first. Your sister. Your father. Anyone whose name appears in your phone contacts. They'll make Sebastiano watch too, as punishment for daring to keep something beautiful in a world this ugly. He moved toward the door, then paused at the threshold. You have value here. Real value. But value and survival are not the same thing. Think about which one matters more. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and I sat alone in the study, surrounded by ledgers and manifests and the sudden, crushing understanding that saving Sebastiano's life had placed a target on everyone I'd ever loved. My hands were shaking now, tremors I couldn't control, my breathing shallow and rapid. I thought about Elodie, 21 and brilliant, and completely unaware that her sister's new job had just painted a bullseye on her back. I thought about the kiss 4 nights ago, about Sebastiano's heartbeat under my palm, about the way he'd looked at me like I was something precious in a life built on violence. And I thought about Girolamo's final question, the one that would haunt me every moment until I answered it. Was love worth the cost of everyone else's blood? The door opened again and Sebastiano walked in. his expression darkening the moment he saw my face. "What happened?" he demanded, crossing the room in 3 strides. I looked up at him, this man who'd killed his father, who'd executed his brother-in-law, who'd promised to burn the city for me, and realized I'd already made my choice the moment I'd whispered that warning. There was no going back. There never had been. "Nothing," I lied, and watched him not believe me. The raid never happened because I'd seen it coming 3 days early. A pattern in the surveillance reports. Unmarked vehicles circling the import warehouse on 10th Avenue, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. License plates that traced back to shell companies. And the telltale sign. A building inspector who'd scheduled a safety review for Tuesday morning, which would have given federal agents the legal cover they needed to enter with warrants already prepared. Sebastiano had moved everything by Monday night. The warehouse stood empty when the DA arrived at dawn on Tuesday, their battering ram breaking down a door that led to nothing but legitimate shipping manifests and cleaning supplies. Now it was Tuesday evening, and Sebastiano stood at the penthouse windows watching the city lights blur into constellations, a glass of bourbon forgotten in his hand. I could see the tension draining from his shoulders, the relief of a disaster avoided settling into his bones. $3 million of merchandise, he said quietly. 20 men who would have gone to prison. All of it gone because you noticed a pattern in car rotations. "That's the job," I replied, closing the ledger I'd been reviewing. He turned, and the look on his face made my breath catch. Not gratitude. Something deeper. Something that felt like reverence and hunger tangled together. "No," he said, crossing the room. "That's magic. That's you turning anxiety into prophecy and saving everything I've built." He set down the bourbon and pulled a small wrapped package from his jacket pocket. "I got you something." My hands trembled slightly as I took it, feeling the weight of old paper and leather. I unwrapped it carefully. A first edition, the cover worn smooth by decades of touch. Jane Eyre. The binding was original, the pages yellowed but intact, and when I opened it, I saw an inscription in faded ink. "For my darling Claire, who sees what others cannot." 1847. "How did you?" My voice broke. I'd mentioned Charlotte Bronte exactly once, weeks ago, in passing. "You notice everything about me," Sebastiano said softly, stepping closer. "Did you think I wouldn't notice everything about you? The way you touch books like they're precious. How you go quiet when you're overwhelmed, retreating into observation. How you've built your entire life around seeing without being seen." His hand came up to brush a strand of hair behind my ear, the gesture achingly tender. "But I see you, Charlotte. Every part of you." The book slipped from my fingers onto the desk as I reached for him, pulling him down into a kiss that felt like surrender and claiming all at once. His hands framed my face, thumbs stroking my cheekbones as he kissed me back with a desperation that matched my own. "I thought I'd lose it all today," he murmured against my lips. "The warehouse, the men, the shipment, everything. And all I could think about was that if I went to prison, the Grimaldis would have you. That I wouldn't be able to protect you." "You don't have to protect me from everything," I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. In his world, protection was love. Violence was devotion. And the man currently kissing his way down my throat had proven he'd burn the world before he'd let it take me. He lifted me onto the desk, scattering papers and photographs that no longer mattered. His jacket hit the floor, followed by my blouse, and when his hands mapped the curve of my waist, I felt worshipped and ruined all at once. "Tell me you want this," he said, his voice rough with need and restraint. "Tell me you're choosing this. Choosing me." I looked into his eyes, dark and dangerous and devastatingly sincere, and thought about Girolamo's warning, about Elodie, about every logical reason I should run. But logic had never been able to compete with the way Sebastiano looked at me, like I was both salvation and damnation. "I choose this," I said, pulling him closer. "I choose you." The last of his control shattered. He kissed me like a man drowning, like I was oxygen and obsession, and I kissed him back like a woman who'd finally stopped hiding from the chaos of living. His hands were everywhere, memorizing, claiming, worshipping, and when he finally laid me back against the cool mahogany surface, the city lights casting patterns across our skin, I understood that this was the true point of no return. Not the poison glass. Not Lucian's execution. But this moment, this choice. This man who'd given me a first edition of Jane Eyre and looked at me like I'd hung the stars. Later, much later, we lay tangled together on the leather sofa. His shirt draped over my shoulders, my head resting against his chest where I could hear his heartbeat slow to match mine. The antique book sat on the coffee table, a reminder of how thoroughly he'd learned to read me. "Charlotte," he said into the darkness, his voice sleep-rough and content. "You know I'm not letting you go, right? Ever." I traced the scar along his jaw, this beautiful, terrible man who'd made me his in every way that mattered. "I know." And somewhere in the back of my mind, Girolamo's warning echoed like a prophecy. Value and survival are not the same thing. But wrapped in Sebastiano's arms, high above a city that wanted us both dead, I couldn't bring myself to care which one I'd chosen. The call came at 3 a.m. Not to my phone, they'd taken that precaution away from me, but to Sebastiano's secure line, the one that only rang when something had gone catastrophically wrong. I woke to his voice, cold and controlled in a way that made my blood freeze. "When? Was? How many witnesses?" Another pause, longer this time. "Find them. Now." He ended the call and sat on the edge of the bed. His back to me, shoulders rigid with the kind of tension that preceded violence. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, I could see his hands curled into fists against his thighs. "Sebastiano." My voice came out smaller than I intended. He turned, and the look on his face confirmed every nightmare Girolamo had planted in my mind 3 weeks ago. "Get dressed. Silas is bringing the car around." What happened? The Grimaldis happened. My hands were already shaking as I pulled on clothes, my anxiety spiking into full panic. The Grimaldis. The family who'd lost their poisoning attempt, their inside man, their strategic advantage. All because of me. Girolamo's warning echoed like a scream. "They'll make you watch first. Your sister. Your father." "Tell me," I demanded, following him into the living room where Silas stood with a tablet, his face grim. Sebastiano took the tablet, his jaw tightening as he scanned whatever was on the screen. Then he handed it to me, and my entire world collapsed. The video was grainy, clearly from a security camera. Columbia University's main campus. Timestamp reading 11:47 p.m. 4 hours ago. Elodie walked across the quad with 2 friends, laughing at something on her phone, her blonde hair catching the streetlight. She looked so young, so completely unaware. The van appeared from nowhere. 3 men, faces covered, moving with military precision. Her friends ran. Elodie tried to. One of the men caught her by her hair, dragged her backward as she screamed silently in the soundless footage. They threw her into the van. Gone in 43 seconds. My legs gave out. Sebastiano caught me before I hit the floor, his arms locking around me as I made a sound I didn't recognize, something between a scream and a sob. "We'll get her back," he said into my hair, his voice fierce. "I swear to you, Charlotte, we'll." His phone rang again. He answered it on speaker, still holding me. The voice that came through was smooth, accented, pleased with itself. "Sebastiano Colosimo. How nice to finally speak directly." "Niccolo Grimaldi," Sebastiano replied, his tone flat. "You just declared war." "No, my friend. You declared war when you executed Lucian before he could complete our arrangement. When you moved your warehouse, costing me federal leverage. When you kept that clever little waitress who sees too much." Pause, deliberately cruel. "She's very pretty, your Charlotte's sister. Looks just like her. Same eyes. Same fear." I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think past the image of Elodie, 21 years old, studying architecture, who'd never hurt anyone, in the hands of men who'd tried to poison Sebastiano just to make a point. "What do you want?" Sebastiano asked. "Simple. You come to my compound. Alone. Unarmed. Tomorrow at noon." We'll have a conversation about territory, about respect, about how you've grown too comfortable in Brooklyn. Nicolo's voice dropped lower. And if you don't come alone, if I see so much as a shadow of your men, if you contact the police, well, Elodie is a beautiful girl. It would be a shame if she stopped being beautiful. The line went dead. I pulled away from Sebastiano, stumbling to the window, my reflection ghostly in the glass. This was my fault. Every word Girolamo had said was coming true, and Elodie was paying the price for my choice to stay, to love, to believe I could have something good in a world built on blood. Charlotte. Sebastiano's hand on my shoulder. Gentle despite everything. Look at me. I turned and saw something in his face I'd never seen before. Not anger. Not calculation. Fear. Real human fear. They want me to walk into a trap, he said quietly. If I go, they'll kill me and probably her anyway. If I don't go, they'll definitely kill her. And if I bring my men, it becomes a war that will burn half of New York and still might not save her in time. So what do we do? My voice cracked on the question. He cupped my face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears I didn't remember crying. We do what we've always done. We see what they can't. We find the pattern. We find the angle. His jaw tightened. And we make them regret the day they decided you were a weakness instead of recognizing you as my greatest strength. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt in his eyes. The impossible math of the situation. One man against a compound full of enemies, with Elodie's life hanging in the balance. And I knew, with the same terrible clarity that had shown me the poison in his glass, that tomorrow at noon, someone I loved was going to die. The Grimaldi compound sat on the outskirts of Staten Island, surrounded by 12-foot walls and security cameras that tracked every approach. Sebastiano had spent the night mapping it from satellite imagery, identifying weak points that didn't exist and backup routes that led nowhere. It was a fortress designed to be impenetrable, and he was walking in alone. I sat in the surveillance van 2 blocks away, surrounded by Silas and 4 of Sebastiano's most trusted men, watching the feeds we'd hacked into through contacts that cost Sebastiano a favor he couldn't afford. My hands gripped the edge of the console so hard my knuckles went white. He's approaching the gate, Silas said quietly. On screen, Sebastiano walked with the same unhurried confidence he carried everywhere. His hands visible and empty. His expression unreadable. The gates opened. He disappeared inside. The compound's interior was exactly what I'd expected. Marble floors, expensive art, the veneer of legitimacy covering decades of violence. Niccolo Grimaldi waited in what looked like a library, flanked by 8 armed men whose positions I'd already catalogued from the camera angles. Sebastiano had taught me to see ambushes. This was textbook. And there, in a chair by the window, was Elodie. Bound, gagged, terrified but alive. Relief flooded through me so intensely I nearly sobbed. Sebastiano Colosimo, Niccolo said, spreading his arms in mock welcome. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with a kind of groomed appearance that came from never having to do his own violence. So good of you to accept my invitation. Where's the girl? Sebastiano's voice came through the audio feed, flat and cold. Safe. For now. Niccolo gestured to a table where a single gun lay, polished and loaded. Here's how this works. You pick up that gun. You execute me right here in front of my men. And in return, they let your little analyst sister walk out alive. And then your men kill me, Sebastiano said. Naturally. But the girl lives. That's the trade. Your life for hers. Niccolo smiled. And it was the expression of a man who'd already won. Of course, if you refuse, my men kill you anyway. And we keep Elodie. She'll learn what it means to be leverage against the woman who destroyed our operation. Through the screen, I watched Sebastiano's jaw tighten. He looked at Elodie, then at the gun, calculating odds I knew came out to 0. There's a third option, Sebastiano said. Is there? Yes. He pulled out his phone, pressed a single button. The one where I don't play your game. The compound's front gates exploded inward with the sound of battering rams and shouting. NYPD SWAT teams poured through, their movements coordinated and aggressive, voices screaming commands about warrants and surrender. But these weren't real SWAT teams. I'd watched Sebastiano make the calls last night, arranging this with corrupt officers on his payroll, staging a raid that would look legitimate enough to create chaos. Nicolo's men scattered, torn between protecting their boss and avoiding arrest. In the confusion, Sebastiano moved. Not toward the gun. Toward Elodie. He cut her restraints with a knife that appeared from nowhere, pulled the gag from her mouth. "Run," he told her, pushing her toward the door where the fake officers were corralling Grimaldi's men. "Find Charlotte. She's in a black van 2 blocks north. Run." Elodie ran, sobbing and stumbling but alive. Nicolo grabbed for the gun on the table, but Sebastiano was faster, his hand closing over Nicolo's wrist with crushing force. "You made a mistake," Sebastiano said quietly. "You thought she was my weakness. But I'm hers. And I will burn everything I've built before I let you hurt her family." He released Nicolo, stepped back, and raised his hands as the corrupt officers, playing their role too well, surrounded him with guns drawn. "Sebastiano Colosimo," one of them shouted. "You're under arrest for—" "I know what I'm under arrest for," Sebastiano interrupted, his eyes finding the camera he knew I was watching through. "Just make sure the girl gets out safely." They cuffed him roughly for show, while Nicolo stood frozen in fury and confusion. The raid had accomplished exactly what Sebastiano intended. Chaos that forced the Grimaldis to scatter, confusion that let Elodie escape, and cover for his arrest that would prevent immediate retaliation. He'd sacrificed himself, his freedom, his tactical advantage. All of it for my sister. "We need to go," Silas said, his hand on my shoulder. "The girl's heading this way. We get her secured, then we deal with getting him out." But I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only watch as they led Sebastiano Colosimo, the man who'd killed his father, who'd built an empire on violence, who'd given me first editions and promises, out of the Grimaldi compound in handcuffs. The van door opened and Elodie fell inside, sobbing my name, and I held her while she shook. She was safe, alive, unharmed. And Sebastiano was gone, swallowed by a system he'd corrupted but couldn't control, paying the price for loving me enough to choose my family over his war. "Charlotte," Silas said urgently. "We need to move. Now." I looked at him through tears I couldn't stop. "Can you get him out?" Silas's expression was grim. "The cops he paid off can hold him for 72 hours before charges have to stick. After that—" He trailed off and I understood. After that, the Grimaldis would ensure those charges became permanent, or Sebastiano would disappear into a system designed to break men like him. We had 3 days to save the man who'd saved us. 3 days to prove I was more than just someone who saw patterns. I was someone who could break them. I held Elodie tighter and started planning. 6 months after the Grimaldi compound, I stood in the penthouse watching the sunrise paint the city gold. The ankle monitor on Sebastiano's left leg blinked its steady rhythm from where he sat at his desk, managing an empire through encrypted calls and trusted intermediaries. House arrest. 18 months remaining on a plea deal that Silas and I had negotiated through channels that would have made my former anxious self collapse. But I wasn't that person anymore. The woman who'd saved Sebastiano's life with a whispered warning had learned to do more than observe. She'd learned to act, to threaten, to leverage everything she'd seen in 4 months of working for him into a deal with prosecutors who suddenly discovered their key witnesses had credibility problems and their evidence had chain of custody issues. The Grimaldis had been less fortunate. Nicolo was serving 20 years for kidnapping and racketeering. His organization had fractured. And Sebastiano, from his gilded cage 40 floors above the city, had absorbed their territory piece by piece. "You're thinking too loud," he said without turning around. I smiled despite myself. "How do you know I'm thinking?" "Because you always stand at that exact spot when you're cataloging problems." He ended his call and stood, crossing to where I waited by the windows. The monitor's blinking followed him like a tether, a reminder that even power had limits. What's the problem? No problem. Just wondering if this is what winning feels like. His hand found the small of my back, familiar and possessive. This is what surviving feels like. Winning comes later. He'd grown quieter in captivity, more contemplative. The restless energy that used to drive him through the night had been replaced by a focused intensity that somehow made him more dangerous, not less. Men still feared him. They just had to schedule appointments now. "I have something for you," he said, guiding me to the sofa where 2 items waited on the coffee table, a leather portfolio and a small velvet box that made my heart stutter. Sebastiano. The portfolio first. He handed it to me, watching my face as I opened it. Inside were legal documents, corporate filings, deeds to 7 properties throughout Manhattan and Brooklyn, the Velvet Room and 6 other establishments, all legitimate businesses, catering, event planning, private clubs, all in your name. I stared at the papers, not understanding. "I don't. You saved my life. You saved your sister. You negotiated my freedom when I had none." His voice was soft but absolute. "You've earned this. A legal enterprise that no one can take from you. Something built on your skills, not my violence. You can walk away from all of this, from me, and still have a future." "I don't want to walk away. I know." He picked up the velvet box, opened it to reveal a ring that took my breath. An emerald surrounded by diamonds, vintage and elegant and clearly chosen with the same attention he'd given to that first edition months ago. "But I need you to choose it anyway. Not because you're afraid. Not because you're trapped. Because you want this life, even knowing what it costs." He slid off the sofa, kneeling in front of me despite the ankle monitor, despite the house arrest, despite being a man who'd spent his life demanding others kneel to him. "Charlotte Johnson. You see everything. You know exactly who I am and what I've done. You know I killed my father and executed my brother-in-law and orchestrated a fake arrest to save your sister." His hands took mine, steady and warm. "You know that loving me means accepting bodyguards and encrypted phones and always watching for poison in your glass. So I'm asking you to choose it. Choose me. Marry me. Build something legitimate together while I finish serving my time. And when I'm free, we'll expand it into something that makes us untouchable without anyone needing to die for it." The ring caught the morning light, throwing rainbows across his face. 6 months ago, I'd been a waitress who'd saved a stranger from assassination. Now I was being offered legitimacy and love by a man who'd proven he valued my family more than his empire. "The anxiety doesn't go away," I said quietly. "I'll still count exits and catalog threats and see danger in every shadow." "Good." His smile was fierce. "That's what keeps us alive. That's what makes you perfect." I thought about Girolamo's warning, about the cost of loving powerful men, about Elodie, safe now and finishing her degree, protected by security I'd insisted on, about my father, sober for 3 months in a facility Sebastiano paid for anonymously, about the empire we could build together, one that existed in daylight instead of shadows. "Yes," I said, and watched relief and joy transform his face into something almost vulnerable. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto my finger, pulled me down into a kiss that tasted like morning coffee and promises, and when we finally broke apart, the sun had fully risen over a city that belonged to us in ways that had nothing to do with territory or violence. "Mrs. Colosimo," he murmured against my lips, testing out the name. "Not yet," I corrected. "You have to survive 18 more months first. With you watching my back." He traced the line of my jaw, his touch reverent. "I'll survive anything." And standing in that penthouse, wearing his ring and holding the deed to my future, I believed him. Not because the danger was gone, it never would be, but because we'd learned to see it coming. Together. The ankle monitor blinked its steady rhythm. The city sparkled below. And Charlotte Johnson, who'd once been too anxious to walk into a classroom, had just agreed to marry the most dangerous man in New York. Some people would call that insanity. I called it the only choice I'd ever made where I knew exactly what I was choosing. Chaos, danger, love, and a man who'd burn the world before he'd let it take me. I'd spent my whole life afraid. But fear, I'd learned, was just another pattern to observe, another threat to catalog, another thing that looked different when you weren't facing it alone. And I would never be alone again. So, would you have warned him? Would you have taken the ring? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if Charlotte's story had you hooked from that first poison glass to the final proposal, you need to subscribe. Because every week, we're bringing you stories about women who see what others miss and the powerful men who can't let them go. The next video is already queued up on your screen. Click it. Promise it's worth it. Subscribe, comment, and I'll see you in the next story.